And the question is that who is really Trump's enemy? What is he really going against? I think for the top US companies, they probably benefited as well.
Yep.
So they have the incentive to maintain that as well. So if you look from that lens, I think the interests are sort of more aligned to the interest of the Chinese government and the interest of American corporates.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave.
So a lot has happened over the past few weeks. I think we had Liberation Day, we had the tariffs, we had the China matching the tariffs, and now there's a tariff pause. So lots of different things that have happened. So how are you thinking about all of this?
First, I'm trying to recover from a hangover because over the last 4 weeks, last 6 weeks, I've been to 7 cities in China, plus Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. So obviously this is happening while the whole world is watching these places, and we read the Financial Times, etc. Everyone's telling you about, okay, they've been speaking to the sellers, they've been speaking to businesses in China, how do they feel? So yeah, it's lots of information to unpack and lots of perspectives and lots of drinking as well. And we're talking briefly before this. You were saying that are they celebrating or are they sort of drowning their sorrows? I think sentiment-wise, I think most people don't know what to do. No, seriously, most people don't know what to do. I mean, it's just I think in early March, and people are still pushing aggressively to relocate some of the manufacturing to Vietnam. And so we brought a delegation of Chinese businesses to Ho Chi Minh City. I mean, 50 of them showed up. So, which is a large group to manage. But a few days later, I think when that tariff on Vietnam was slapped on, and people were just confused. What should we do next?
I mean, I think first of all, it was totally unexpected, right? I mean, I think tariffs were expected. I think Vietnam was making some moves beforehand by dropping tariffs on American goods before Liberation Day.
Yeah.
But I think the scale was like
It's
an
like,
order.
wow. So people really got it by surprise.
Yeah.
So what should I do? Vietnam, Cambodia, and so somehow it's interesting that when the Chinese government decided to, I wouldn't say retaliate, but sort of mash up, right? So I really see two different sentiments. One sentiment is that people saying that, nah, there's nothing we can do, so might as well just spend some time, play cards, let's relax a little bit, let's see what goes. And some factories are saying that, okay, let's just pause for a while. It's actually some of them really paused, which is weird because for a long time, and many of them telling me that, okay, they can't afford to pause. And the second is that the second group of people, which I find very, really interesting, that they're sharing sort of clips of the Korean War.
Oh, the Korean War?
Yeah, because that was the first time that the communist government of China sort of managed to defend against a much more superior US army in Korea. So some of them putting out the clips from back then saying that, yeah, we can eat bitterness and this.
I have to say this, that it's funny that you say that, but from the Chinese perspective, they thought they won the war against. I think most people in America think that they won the Korean War by defending South Korea against South Korea.
So people decided to take different narratives, right?
Yeah.
And maybe that's how this current conflict or current trade will end, right? I mean, each party takes a narrative, they tell a story to their domestic audience, their life carries on. I mean, that's what we hope.
Yeah, no, I just find it funny that both sides claim victory.
Yeah, because at this juncture, you don't see a clear way for either of them to back down without losing face.
Yeah, it's definitely been an interesting set because I think Trump has raised tariffs several times, obviously, first in his first administration, now second administration, and he's done that several layers. And now China has kind of retaliated with a matching mirror, tit for tat, equivalent tariff. And then Trump has just escalated further now to, I think it's targeting 125%.
145 now, with the 20%.
Oh, okay, sorry, I lost track of the number.
Above a certain number, it doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah, because nobody has. I was just telling my friend.
Yeah.
I was talking to there was a group of Swiss entrepreneurs who came to Singapore and we were just having this conversation.
Yeah.
And I was saying, like, imagine you're a manufacturer and somehow you have 50% net margin, which doesn't happen, but
Which is very rare, yeah.
very, very rare. And then if you have 100% tariff, that means effectively you have no more margin and you're losing money.
Yeah.
So effectively 100% tariff by both sides effectively means that trade is effectively loss-making for any manufacturer for them to trade with one another based on the current tariff levels.
A few of them I spoke to told me that, okay, they have no choice. They will raise the price. You either accept it or we stop the shipment.
Yeah.
So as simple as that.
Yeah.
So I asked them, I mean, how do you think about for the long term? They said, we don't know.
You can't think of the long term when it changes every day, right?
Yeah, I think for the Chinese government point of view, they are probably, because knowing this how, I mean, local governments are very different. Sometimes they do things on a whim.
Yeah.
And the central government within launch a policy, they usually have done quite a bit of study and predicted it, not predicted, but sort of mapped out different scenarios and usually scenario they how they should respond. So I think by responding to Trump with a retaliatory tariff, they have probably thought about different scenarios. They've probably prepared some tools in a toolbox. I mean, whether it's something that, because remember last year, people were saying that, okay, Chinese government was not spending enough of the ammunition to save the market or to sort of boost domestic consumption. Back then, there was a saying that, okay, maybe they're preparing for something. Maybe that's the thing they're preparing for. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I think the tricky part about all of this is like there are different layers, right? There's like the Chinese, like kind of like federal or the national government, and there's the local governments, and then there's the local factories, and obviously there's Vietnam and I'll say Cambodia as well. And they are also part of this and to the side, but around there, right? And I think there's an interesting, I don't know, Rubik's Cube where everybody's trying to figure out, have a play of one another. Maybe let's focus more on the Chinese national government because everybody's like reading the tea leaves and trying to figure out what is Xi Jinping thinking, what is he doing. So it sounds like one is that they have said that they want to do a stimulus package, right? Because of to support their exporters. I think that's one. Two is that Xi Jinping is planning to visit Vietnam and Cambodia.
And Malaysia.
And Malaysia. That's part in about 2 weeks' time.
Yes.
So there's going to be a big move. But I guess the question that, I feel like those are like, they're supposed to support. But I guess the big question is, what do you think his relationship with Donald Trump is going to be? Are they trying to if Trump raises 120, 140%, will he match? And then after that, they'll negotiate with each other and then bring it down? Like, how do you think? Yeah.
I feel in this kind of situation, both parties are willing to negotiate. But the question is that, I mean, how do you find a way that they can come down to the negotiation table without losing face? I mean, if you look at the situation in Europe with Russia and Ukraine, I think both parties want to negotiate. I mean, maybe it's not like a good sort of parallel, but both parties want to negotiate, but their starting positions are probably very different.
Right.
And if one party shows sort of weakness,
Right.
it sends a very wrong signal to the other party, right? So the question is then now how this is going to play out. I do think that if you look at some of the narrative from some stakeholders in the US, they were saying that, so I think some advisor to Trump was saying that they have successfully sort of isolated China because other people try to negotiate with the US and China's not, etc., etc. But quite often, I think when all this like extreme wars are, and I do believe that things have a possibility of settling quickly, but they might not because there are things which are beyond each party's control, right?
Yeah.
I do remember many years ago when Didi and Uber, like 2 weeks before the merger in the Chinese market, and both parties are ratcheting up their war of words. Like each party saying, we're winning and we're going to spend more, etc., etc., etc. But when that happened, they were actually negotiating a deal. It's just that on our side, you need to have a better position to get more from the deal.
Yeah, exactly.
Same for the Korean War.
Yeah.
They spent so many years, and each time when they're close to get a deal, and there are like aggressive military movements.
Yeah. So I think there's the public phase where obviously it's happening on Truth Social.
Yes.
On Twitter/X, right?
All the state media.
All the media. I think so. Trump it's fair that he has said that he wants to negotiate with China. He sees this as part of the deal-making process. So I think that's relatively clear. I think the issue is that for people, China feels more opaque because, and so everybody's reading. And
yes. Everybody's trying to interpret like.
And you're like, I was like reading the reviews, and I was like, is this like how many layers of translation did happen already? Is this really signed off by Xi Jinping? Because I know recently they released another research report that was by the Chinese ministry that was analyzing trade flows and I think it was a good paper actually was that, and it was written in English. And what it was saying was that although China sells more goods to America, so there's a trade deficit in goods, but America does sell more services to China than China sells services to America. So there's a services surplus. And obviously there's still an overall, if you look netted out, America buys more from China than China buys from America, but the order of magnitude is much smaller once you include services as part of it. So I thought it was a interesting analysis that was done by the Chinese economists, and they wrote it in English. So I thought it was a good ammunition for all of us in the space to kind of like look at some of the factual numbers. But I'm just kind of curious, like,
I think a couple of things. First, that paper you referred to, I
Yeah.
mean, it was not compiled overnight, right?
Yeah.
Even though now we have DeepSeek, we can't compile that paper overnight and get it signed off by all the people. So, so that was probably one of the tools in the toolbox for them to use in certain situations. And overall, I think you probably know that China benefited a lot from the last 20 years, 22 years, or 22 or 24. I mean, years of WTO membership, of global trade, of current order. So I think they have a lot of incentive to maintain a current order. I think for the top US companies, they probably benefited as well. So they have the incentive to maintain that as well. So if you look from that lens, I think the interests are sort of more aligned, the interest of the Chinese government and the interest of American corporates. And the question is that who is really Trump's enemy? What is he really going against?
Oh, lots of questions, right? Well, I think some people are saying that he's pushing to focus on the American swing voter, which is the Rust Belt, the people who are doing manufacturing, blue collar jobs.
He probably knows that blue collar jobs will not come back. Or rather, I mean, it would take him, I don't know, 6-7 years of extreme pain to bring them back. And by the time there will already be another election, so probably can't think that long term. So I'm just curious. I've seen different interpretations. The truth is, I don't know. I've seen interpretations of a way to reduce the debt, which I think, judging from what happened with the bond market, it has been going the opposite direction.
Yeah.
And there's also a interpretation of Trump being religious about reducing the deficit. So that could be his reason, but I don't know. I mean, we're not close to Trump enough to understand what's going in his mind. And we know that I think some of his advisors are now accusing each other of certain things. I don't know.
I think for me, I think Trump comes across as more agile. So I would say that when you read about how he works with his team, he tends to like to have many different people in the room, and he likes to have different voices, and he doesn't mind changing his mind based on what people are telling him. So he likes that classic people is like, and then they all disagree with one another, and then he listens to everybody, and then he makes a decision. So I think it's more of that kind of a little bit more collaborative as within his inner circle. So I think there's not necessarily a animating philosophy. I think it just comes across to me. It's like he's more like, okay, today this is what happened, therefore we'll do this tomorrow, or maybe more like this is what happened yesterday, and this is what I'm going to do today, right? So I think it's a little bit more like, I would say, like iterative as opposed to
There was a long time ago, I had a long chat with some businessman who spent a lot of years of hardship in the Mao era, and then afterwards he built a successful business. And he was telling me something which I don't necessarily agree, even to this day. And he was saying that when you run a business, you always make sure that there's conflict amongst the one or two layers below you. I said, why do you do that? So he said, to make sure that I always get the right message. Because if there's no conflict, so people might just do whatever I like, or whatever they perceive that I like. So I'm not sure whether that applies to Trump as well. But I don't know. I mean, it's sort of, I don't know. I mean, Liberation Day, the whole tariff thing for me is counterintuitive.
Yeah, I would say that I think the bond markets and the interest rates going up was backfired, right? So maybe I'll just kind of like explain it for the benefit of both of us and get the sense of it, right? But I think the big issue we have is that in America, they spend more than they earn in terms of tax revenue, right? And so the way they solve that in the short term is they borrow money, right? And then that borrow money is based on the bonds market, and those interest rates was pretty low, and so as a result the amount they had to repay was pretty low, and so it made it allow them to continue spending more than they earn from taxes. But of course now the bond market starting to seize up because of all of this uncertainty and so forth. Interest rates are starting to go up, and so the expected interest payments are going to go up, which makes it harder for them to keep that deficit, and so it makes the math harder for everybody. So nobody wants that. I think both Republicans and Democrats, if they can agree on one thing, is that they want lower interest rates on the bond market, right? And I think that it has gone up because of all the risk and uncertainty. So I was reading on X, and I think it was interesting, but there was people speculating on Twitter about is China dumping treasuries? Is it China part of the reason? I don't know. So
The speculation I read was more of the Japanese doing that
because
they hold lots of treasuries as well.
yeah, so, no, I think it's funny because I believe Joe Lonsdale was like, "Hey, is the Chinese doing this?" That's a question mark. I mean, it's a fair question to ask.
Yeah.
And then now you're saying maybe it's the Japanese. I guess if you ask the Japanese, maybe they think the US, the hedge funds are doing it. So everybody's. I mean, it could be everybody, right?
Oh yeah, but China and Japan hold a lot, right?
Yeah.
So even if they like offload a small percentage, that impacts the prices quite a lot. So, but that sort of gives you something about reality, right? I mean, things are changing fast, and you don't know which direction things are changing towards, and the things that you think would be sort of a relief and whatever can get reversed the next day.
Yeah.
And that's what I don't know. I mean, as business people, that we kind of hate, right? We can't predict. I mean, of course, you can say that you can profit from, I don't know, the uncertainty, but the truth is that, I mean, how do you do that when things are so uncertain, when things reverse so fast?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the tricky part, right? I mean, even for us, as we're processing our feelings, for us, it's going to take us 1 week for our podcast to come out.
Yeah,
And by
exactly.
then, things could have changed by then, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's a very fluid situation.
We did a vote about, I mean, we published a vote on our WeChat channel and asking people, I mean, specifically about tariffs imposed on Vietnam. That was
Yeah.
before the pause.
Yeah.
And to our surprise, like
Yeah.
more than 2,000 people voted on that vote.
Yeah.
And most people are saying, I think the predominant, no, I mean, there's no predominant, but about 35% of the people said, let's wait and see, maybe we'll get it reversed
Yeah.
the next week.
Yeah.
And 25% of the people are saying that, oh, it doesn't matter where we go now, Trump will hunt us down. That kind of like sort of lie flat and give up kind of attitude.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I don't know. I mean, this is what I often say to people nowadays. And people ask me what I think about this, what I think about that. I said, okay, I mean, if this go this way, this is what they should do. But how will things go? I don't know.
Yeah, I get it. I guess maybe one question I have
Yeah.
is when you think about all of this, obviously there's a lot of movement in the short term, but like if you were to make a prediction in 1 year's time, and obviously, yeah, we could be horribly wrong.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But I'm just saying, like, what do you think is going to happen? So my guess, I mean, I'll just toss it out, right? My guess is in 1 year, Trump and China make a deal, and there's some deal on services, there's some deal on goods, and everybody will continue having a China plus one strategy because you never know that this deal may not last.
Yeah.
And so there will continue to be the rise of Chinese multinational corporations that will expand factories in Southeast Asia, I don't know, LATAM or America or wherever it is. And then also I expect Southeast Asia to strike deals with America as well. How about you think about that?
I think the challenge just now is that, I mean, we did speak with some government players of a few countries in the last few weeks. But the problem is now is that you don't know what to trust, right? I mean, you can't trust that the sort of the established order, the institutions will prevent all these aggressive tactics from happening. So what do we do in the meantime? Diversify, right? I mean, most people, from sort of a point of influence that we have spoken to, are saying that we can't rely on any of the parties, and we have to sort of diversify. We have to find ways. We have to, reach out to more people. And even some exporters we're talking to, we spoke with quite a few in Vietnam last 2 weeks. And they were saying that we try to benefit or do business with both China and the US, and we can't rely on any of them, either of them. So I think most countries will try to carve that middle ground.
Yeah.
And I think China and the US will continue sort of rally support.
Yep.
So I would think that most countries will play along with either party,
Yeah.
but without throwing the full weight. I mean, look at the response from Canada to the US. Of course, there's election coming, but it's quite forceful.
Yeah.
It's quite aggressive.
So let's talk about that. When you say diversify, it's very generic, right? So I think one thing, obviously, I agree with is that if I was an American company, I would diversify away from China as a supplier.
Yeah.
Because of the potential for more tariffs. But I think you're also meaning something else for diversify. What does it mean for Chinese exporters? What does it mean for them to diversify? And then what does it mean for example, a country like Vietnam or Cambodia to diversify?
I think, so if you look at, traditionally, I think people in China, so businesses, China export-oriented business, be it e-commerce, be it sort of contract manufacturers, they have the belief that the US is the largest market, and whichever order they receive from the US is usually the largest. For cross-border e-commerce, it's the most lucrative. And when we think about the effort that you have to explore different markets, if you really want to do well in multiple markets, it requires a lot more thinking, a lot more sort of navigation, a lot more sort of going through the different rules, different regulations and stuff. And aside from a few top players, it's actually quite hard. I mean, if you own a business, you have like, I don't know, 200 people doing manufacturing, traditionally so selling to two large customers in the US. And when I ask you to diversify, it's hard, but many of them making an effort, right? So among the 50 people who went with us to Vietnam, a few of them saying that I don't have anything tangible that I'm doing, but I know I need to diversify.
Gotcha.
So, I mean, let me talk to the business there to see what they think and what we can potentially do. I don't know what we can do. When we talk to businesses in Vietnam, it's interesting. So they acknowledge that in certain areas like consumer electronics, there's no way that they can build an industry that's as competitive as China. But they think that there are many other industries that they should find more to export to China more. So we actually went to visit a bird nest farm.
Oh, a bird's nest, yeah.
Bird's nest farm, and in a part of Ho Chi Minh City that's covered by mangrove. So basically they build houses in the village nearby, and the birds will eat in the mangrove forest and then come back. And they're saying that, okay, I mean, this is the product which we believe are better than the ones you source in Malaysia.
Right.
But how do we get the brand name out? How do we sell more to China? So
Interesting.
So these are the things that there are lots of business movements, and it's interesting when you talk to individual businesses that they find ways to navigate that sometimes with the solutions that you don't predict, right? Yeah.
No, it's interesting because when you look at a country like Vietnam, I think that was one of the more unexpected areas, right? Obviously, we didn't expect Trump and China tariffs to go to 100%. So that's one. But the other part I think people were surprised by was that Vietnam and Cambodia were impacted so heavily to such a high percentage. I also would probably add Laos, that dynamic. Also, I think say Malaysia and Indonesia also got very high, around 20 to 30+% as well of tariffs as well. So I think the whole of Southeast Asia, excluding Singapore was at the lowest.
10%.
But of course, we have to acknowledge that Singapore and China, I have to acknowledge that Singapore and US have a free trade agreement. So technically it's 0-0.
Yeah.
And Singapore buys more from America than America buys from Singapore. Anyway, so let's put Singapore aside. So Singapore is like, anyway.
Yeah.
So, okay, it's not great for Singapore. But I think all of these countries all kind of like really got hammered. I think Singapore's expecting a tariff.
Yeah.
But they were not expecting 10%, but still it's not that.
Yeah.
A 10% is like doable, but I think 20, 30, 40% was as way high as a starting position for the negotiation. I guess when you think about it, do you think like maybe Vietnam is like thinking to themselves like, this is just a negotiating tactic to start and then we negotiate down to 20%? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what the...
I do think they're negotiating, right? So I think very shortly after the announcement, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam, Mr. Tô Lam, had a call with Trump.
Yeah.
I do think that sort of some positions were traded during that call, and I think if I were a decision maker, I'll probably do both, right? First I'll try to negotiate, and second that I'll try to diversify because when you know that this came out of nowhere, now becomes a sort of asking position that you need to negotiate down, even though you might reach a deal. But would the other party have a full trust afterwards? I doubt so.
Yeah, I think that's actually the crux of it, actually, which is, I think that if you look at it from a deal perspective, it's very important to have what they call a price anchor. So you anchor a very aggressive position so that when then you're just negotiating down from that starting position, right? You get a better position than if you. But of course, I think the problem, like you said, is that there's a breaking of trust if it's too aggressive. And I think that's what the sensation I'm getting from a lot of people in the region is like I think everybody was willing to negotiate with America.
Yeah, I mean that's a practical point, right? You have to negotiate because what's the alternative, right? But aside from negotiation, you're probably trying something else to reduce the risk.
Correct. So I think in the short term, I think this move does get the current Republican administration what they want, which is probably a better deal, I think, on average, that if they had come in maybe even more, I don't know, I'm just trying to imagine how if Mitt Romney or John McCain tried to do the same move and have the same policy belief, they probably would have done it in a different way. Yeah. And so maybe the deal that is currently in position would probably be better for America, I think, but I do think that, like you said, I think the problem is that I think an element of trust has been broken. And I think once that's broken, I think that's hard to repair.
I mean, you would have a relationship that which on the surface is more cordial. If there's no underlying trust, I mean, I don't know. I think it would be very different compared to, the system that we have seen in the past few decades, right?
Yeah. So I think it's interesting because you say like Vietnam is diversifying. One way to diversify is instead of selling more to the US, they would sell more to China. They also probably partner more with Singapore.
Yeah, I mean, for the agricultural products, they want to sell more to Thailand. They want to sell more to to Malaysia, they want to sell more to Singapore, they want to sell more to Korea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think there's going to be a big push. So I guess what are the business opportunities? They say that in every crisis there's opportunity. So what are the opportunities? Is it like, I don't know, setting up a Vietnamese bird nest brand in China or in Southeast Asia? Yeah.
I think one thing like I might have told you this, that about a year ago I was in a dinner with some of the really successful cross-border e-commerce players in Shenzhen. Yeah, so I bring the average net worth down for that table. But anyway, so and at the dinner I was asking people, how do you think about Southeast Asia? And the response I got from most of them is that I don't have time for Southeast Asia. And even I do, and I look at American angle. So so now I speak with some of them. They're saying that okay, maybe like beyond the US, there are other markets I should take more seriously. Even if you look at TikTok, I mean nowadays it's going everywhere. So people are saying that if US gets banned and that you lose, I don't know, half of your international market sort of ad revenue, you lose I think 20 or 30% of your sort of e-commerce. So is that end of view? But what we have seen in the last few months, it launched in 6 countries, 3 or 4 countries already, but a few other countries in the pipeline in Europe, right? They're going to launch in East Asia, Korea, Japan, and they launched in Mexico, and they're going to launch in Brazil. So so you see that previously they were saying that okay, we need to concentrate our resources to crack the US market. Now they're saying that no, I mean we should diversify, we should look at all these markets, and of course it's tougher to do all this at once, but I would probably see more interesting like flows of business and trade amongst all these markets for these markets per se, rather than okay, now how can I sort of find a way to get into the US?
Yeah, I think maybe like kind of like putting a sub point to that would be, I think that if you're an employee willing to work for a Chinese multinational corporation, then this is a good opportunity because I think we want to see more Chinese companies move out of China, set up offices in Singapore and Southeast Asia to explore. So I think that's one opportunity. I think the other opportunity is I think as a consumer, you're probably going to see a lot of cheaper goods from China as well because they open up more products in Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
And they're going to see more competition because I think there's a bunch of, obviously in every market, there's obviously local competitors. So for example, in Gojek, they're discussing with Grab to merge. But then now I think Indonesia has the rumors that China is going to launch ride hailing in Indonesia as well. So I think there's an interesting competition dynamic.
Yes, and now both Meituan and Didi are launching food delivery in Brazil.
So we're just competing with kind of a C group as well. Yeah.
So you see all these dynamics. It's interesting that we try to make predictions.
Yeah.
But what you potentially see is people forming opinion about certain development, and they are trying to act on that opinion. Then that forms a trend, right?
Yeah.
So one example is that okay, every Chinese e-commerce player was thinking about the US market, and they thought it was too hard. But when Temu went in, everybody said, okay, if they can go in, why can't I go in? So now we see, I mean, if some of them are shut out of the US markets, they will reassess the other markets in a more aggressive way.
Yeah.
The question I think for many of them is still that how can they build this? I mean, for selling goods, yes, for sure. I mean, they have to manufacture sort of leverage that they can play. But for really building like long-lasting business models, platforms in different countries, how do they work effectively with the local players? I mean, selling goods is straightforward, right? I mean, you find local distributors or you pay the local tax, etc. For businesses like the food delivery, like ride hailing, how do you work effectively with the local ecosystem so that you become someone who find a way to benefit the local sort of upstream and downstream as well as the whole ecosystem without taking all the benefits yourself?
Yeah. And I think that's a tricky part because I think if you're like a local conglomerate of business, you're going to see a lot more competition from Chinese exporters and MNCs expanding. So I expect, if I was to say one more prediction about 1 more year out, I expect there'll be a growing movement lobbying local governments to erect barriers to Chinese exporters. Yeah.
We already see that. So last few weeks, I also had the chance to interact with CEOs and senior executives of a few Latin American companies.
Yeah.
And the incumbent companies, I think their opinion is fairly sort of strong against all this Chinese incursion.
Yeah, exactly. Because they're like, I was barely making a profit. I'm making a small profit.
That probably make a decent profit. If they are the incumbent, only like
incumbent, and making like super normal profit, 40-50%, and then. But now, it's the Chinese going after the pie.
Yeah, but the question is that because many of the Chinese players, they have endured competition in China.
Yeah.
So they are willing to endure super low profit margin to make a business work.
Right.
And that's what I think some of the Indonesian business saw the impact. But of course, I think Indonesia has kind of erected enough sort of,
Yeah.
I wouldn't say barrier, but has raised the bar of the entry so that the opportunistic players can't enter so easily. I mean,
Right.
for whoever enters, they have to be long-term.
Right.
But how would that impact in other countries like Brazil, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, etc.? So we will see a lobby, and we will see that some of the businesses from China trying to adapt. And I was talking to some business people saying that, hey, your top lieutenant who built a business together with you, now they speak English, and it's kind of hard to expect them to function effectively in other countries, attract the best sort of talent in those countries. So I think you need to find a different way. And which way? I don't know. I mean, there are a few examples you can look at, but how do you figure out your own path? I mean, you have to figure out yourself.
Yeah. And last question here is, there's only one way that China stops doing an incursion or like globally on the export markets. And I think a lot of US economists are pushing for China to switch to a domestic consumption economy instead of an export-led economy. Do you think that's ever going to happen? Or you think it's just not going to happen? I mean, I'm just kind of curious. Yeah.
You know, I think something needs to be done to boost the consumer confidence. I did speak with lots of consumers in China I mean, since the pandemic.
Right.
So the confidence has not been good. So many things have to be done so that I think first it absorbs some of the manufacturing capacity. And the second is that, how would I say, when your manufacturing is very competitive and you naturally try to spill over and one or another. So the question is, I don't think that a strong domestic consumption would prevent Chinese businesses from spilling out and finding other opportunities. The question is that how do they find ways to work with? We talk about globalization, and the ideal scenario is that you do what you are best at, I do what I'm best at, and we will find a way to work together.
Correct.
So how do they find that way to work together, knowing that in manufacturing, in many areas of manufacturing, you just simply can't build the economies of scale that China has?
Yeah, I mean, I think the tricky part is that I think nobody is against China doing more manufacturing, but I think the sensation is kind of like what happened to the Japanese, right? What happened to the Germans when they became manufacturing powerhouses back then was more like, okay, how do you make sure that you're doing what you're best at, but you also have a domestic consumption that's sufficient to absorb, I don't know, 50 to 80% of your own manufacturing capacity. So that when
it doesn't become like race to the bottom.
It doesn't become a race to the bottom in every single market, because then otherwise, if we keep pursuing this strategy and it goes on steroids, then the concern that Indonesia and Vietnam are going to have is, to some extent, is I have a manufacturing class and it's going to get hollowed out the same way it was hollowed out in Ohio, in America, or Michigan. Like those blue collar jobs are going to disappear, and then there's going to be a bunch of consumers, a bunch of white collar folks are doing services, and then they'll both buy stuff from Chinese manufacturers, and there's no more blue collar, and that's not a very sustainable society to have. I think that's what people are going to have. So anyway, sounds like we don't have the answers, but maybe we can do that next time around, and let's talk about
that's a very thick topic.
But it's like, what would it take for the Chinese economy to become domestic consumption oriented? Which is, I think, if like all this trade stuff and all this all short term, I think that's really the magic question. Is if somebody pulls the trigger on, we are going to orientate towards domestic consumption, I think that will be the true turning of the chapter of the China story.
I would say that the stabilizing property market is imperative for that to happen.
Yeah, but we don't know when it's going to happen as well.
Yeah.
On that note, we'll just have to tune in for the next time we do this. Okay, all right. See you.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.